In this video, I will demonstrate how to turn your Stata outputs, such as this, into professional, more readable tables. Just to give you an idea of what we've got going on for the last week of class, here is an outline of your research paper. Up until this point, you have completed the cover page, the introduction, the literature review, and the theory and hypotheses section. Now, what we've been doing in the Stata Computer Lab is working on the final remaining sections of your paper, the data section and the conclusion section. Now, if you decided to add any additional sources over the Thanksgiving break, obviously you'll need to incorporate those into the bibliography section, but really your research papers are almost completely finished. And what we're going to be doing today is picking up on what exactly needs to be in the data section, or the section 4 of your research paper. Now, if you're unclear about what's required in sections 4 and 5, the data and conclusion sections, please refer back to the iCollege module of the research paper guidelines and rubric. Section 4, data, is going to begin with a discussion of the operationalization of your variables. What is the dependent variable? How is it measured? What are the independent variables? How are they measured? Are they ratio, nominal, ordinal? Is it a 1 through 4 coding? If so, what does 1, 2, 3, 4 stand for, etc.? Or if you're working with public opinion data, be very specific about where that data comes from, the number of participants you have, and things like that. The paragraphs under the data section are going to include these models that we're working with today. And I'm going to show you how to properly report this type of data into your research paper in a way that makes sense for the reader. So when you're creating tables to go into your research paper, because remember, copy and pasting is not acceptable. I'll discuss that later. So when you're creating tables, it's only necessary for 4 different types of analyses. And that's correlation matrices, cross-tabulations, with or without chi-squares, but you should always include the chi-square if possible. ANOVA pairwise mean comparisons, and regression models, and that could be bivariate or multivariate. But those are the types of analyses that are going to require you to do a little bit extra work and to put those outputs from those models into more readable Microsoft Word tables, which this video is going to show you how to do. So first, let's look at the data and see what type of outputs we have. You'll notice throughout this presentation that we're only using the first 5 variables in the data set, right? So we're not making these really giant monster tables, but you certainly can feel free to have more than 5 variables in the tables that you create for your research paper. Now let's look over these data outputs. So the first analysis we have here is a correlation matrix. Again, this demonstrates how correlated each variable is to one another. You may include this information in your research paper if a lot of your variables are correlated with the dependent variable, which in this case is % of votes for Trump, listed here in the first column, or you may decide to not include this information. The choice is ultimately yours. If you run a correlation matrix and a lot of the variables aren't really strongly correlated, then there's not much of a point in including this information. Every table that you include in your research paper, you want it to have a meaningful discussion behind it, right? So every figure or every table that you include in your research paper, you should have something meaningful to say about it. Okay, so let's talk about why copying and pasting this type of information is unacceptable. If you look here at the variable names, they're not full words, they're abbreviations for what the variables actually stand for. It's not intuitive to understand what exactly these variables mean, and for that reason, you're required to put this information into an additional table. So if we wanted to take this correlation matrix, for example, and put it into a new table, the process of doing such is rather simple. So all we have to do is take our Word document here, and we're going to go to the Insert tab in the ribbon, Table, and then we're going to determine how many columns and rows we need. So I can see we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then that would be a 6 by 6. So we'll just go to 6, all the way down to 6. We're going to enter this down a little bit. Now, every table needs a name, and the name should properly convey the information that's being presented in the table. And also, the tables need to be named in the order that they appear in the research paper. So since this is the first table that we're putting into the research paper, this will be called Table 1. And the title is going to tell us what the information in the table is conveying. So this would just be correlation matrix of variables. Very simple. Now we'll start here, and we're just going to put in the information as it appears in the Stata outputs over here, but we're going to give the variable names proper names, right? So this is % of votes for Trump. Okay, now the next thing we need to do is simply input the values from the table into the corresponding cell. So we can begin with 1, because obviously %Trump and %Trump are perfectly correlated with each other. And we can just enter that information all the way down through the remainder of the table. And then we'll enter our correlation coefficients here. Make sure to round up for each bit of information here, right? So we've got 0.429, so I've rounded that up to 0.43. Okay, and now we have our correlation matrix of variables in a nice, clean, reformatted table. Now at the very end of this presentation, I'm going to show you how to get rid of some of these lines in between all of the data and make everything look really, really pretty and professional. So if you end up getting a job after college that has anything to do with data analysis or report creating, this is going to be really, really helpful information that you'll need to know on the job market. So in this space down here, you would, write up discussion on importance of table 1, right? And then you would, obviously the text of your paper would not be bolded. And then you would move on to your next analysis. So in this case, our next analysis that we have here looks like a cross-tabulation between region, so whether it's a northern state or a southern state, and type of legislative control. And there's also a chi-square statistic in this analysis here. So let's go ahead and create the title for our next table, which is Table 2. Okay, and now we'll begin creating our table, and we're going to follow the same steps as before. So we're going to click on Insert, Table. We're determine how many rows and columns we need. So I see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4. So this looks like a 5 by 4. And we'll hit Enter to give us some space between the title and the data. Okay, so here we have our variable name called South, and the labels for the values of that variable are northern states and southern states. So let's just call our variable something that's a little bit more intuitive. We're going to call this region, and then we'll have northern states and southern states. And then we'll write our totals here. And now we've got our different types of party control of the state legislature. And then add totals here. Now the only other thing we have to do is enter the information as it appears in the table. And then we're done. So remember, we only have 49 states in this analysis because Nebraska has that unicameral legislature, so that was omitted from the analysis. And just keep in mind that cross-tabulations really only work when both of the variables are dichotomous, nominal, or ordinal. If you want to do a cross-tabulation with a variable that is a ratio level measurement, it's going to look really strange, right? Especially depending on the number of observations you have, right? So if we did a cross-tab of all the 50 states, that means that that cross-tabulation would have 50 rows in it. So just keep your cross-tabulations into perspective here. And I'm just going to unbold this data here, or really all of this, because I don't like the way that looks. Okay, the last thing we need to do is add this chi-square information at the bottom of our cross-tabulation here in this data output. So we're going to go to our table, and if you ever don't add enough rows or columns in your data and you need to add more, you can simply go to the Layout tab right here and use one of these buttons, right? So insert row above, below, to the left, or to the right. We're going to add one below, so we're going to click this button here. And we're also going to merge these cells, so this is one giant cell without any column breaks within that data. So when you're doing things, when you're using tables that have statistics in them, like chi-squares or p-values or things like that, it's a good idea to always put in the threshold p-value of significance in that table. So we need to let the reader know what threshold p-values we have chosen in this research paper. And we've talked a lot about this in class, about, the threshold of p-values are rather arbitrary, right? Do you want to be 80% confident in your results, 90% confident, 99.9% confident? But traditionally, what political scientists use are three-tiered p-values with different ranges of significance, and that's the 0.1 value, the 0.05 value, and the 0.01 value. And then we put little stars next to those different thresholds so the reader can just look at our table and automatically know whether a specific value in the research paper is significant or not. So you put this information here at the bottom simply as p less than 0.1 equals 1 star. And this is not italicized here. Then do a comma. And here you've got the traditional explanation of your p-values here. And we'll put little spaces in between these so it looks nice and neat. And then we're going to report the chi-square here in our crosstab, which basically lets us know whether there's statistical differences between the groups within our data. That is the short explanation. So we'll go to Insert, Advanced Symbol, which is here, and then we'll look for the chi, which I conveniently have highlighted here. We'll insert, close. We'll type in chi-square 2. We'll highlight the 2, go to Home, change that 2 to a superscript, and then we'll enter the value of that chi-square statistic, which is 11.21. So we're rounding up the 0.206 to 0.21. And then we need to determine how many stars we give the chi-square. So first of all, we have to ask ourselves, is the chi-square statistic statistically significant? Well, we see the probability here is 0.004. Is that less than any of these values? Yes, it is less than 0.01, so it has the highest degree of statistical significance. We give it 3 stars because 0.004 is in fact less than 0.01, right? So we are very, very confident in our ability to reject the null hypothesis that there are no statistical significant differences between the groups. All right, the next analysis we're going to go into is the ANOVA, which you can see is denoted by the one-way command in Stata here. So remember, you don't need to turn the one-way command reported here into a table in your research paper. We didn't have time to discuss the significance of the sum of squares or the mean squares. The only thing that I said that was important to note was this probability F statistic right up here. Right? So if that is significant, that means that you do have statistically significant differences between your groups, right? And the model here is trying to predict the number of votes for Trump based upon the party legislative control in each state. So this F statistic is telling us, yes, there are differences between the groups. So if your F statistic is not significant, you can stop here in your research paper, right down here, right? You would write, we tried to analyze but that's about something that you would write in your research paper. But as we can see with our F statistic, that is not the case, so we're just going to simply delete this. And do not use the language we. I work with a lot of co-authors, so I am used to using the language we, but you can just say that an analysis was run to determine if any statistical differences were present, and there were not, right? So don't use the language we unless you have a co-author, which applies to none of you. Okay, so going back to the data here, we do have a significant F statistic in the ANOVA. So as we discussed in class, that means we're going to run a pairwise mean comparison, which is this data here, pairwise mean comparison, which is going to show you the contrast between the groups, right? So this value here in the contrast section is telling us about how much on average the votes for Trump differed between these groups. So reporting these values is a little bit different. We're only going to have two columns. We're going to report the type of group, the contrast. The standard error will be in the same column as contrast, but in parentheses, and then the p-values will be reported through the use of stars. Right, so the whole reason we do this whole p-value with stars and things like that, is to minimize the information that's actually being shown in the table through numerical values, because too many numbers can be a bit confusing and overwhelming for the reader. So let's start with the title. This is going to be Table 3. And then we're going to enter our data. So we're going to go to Insert, Table. We're only going to have two columns, and this will be the same for regression models, right? No matter how many variables you have, you will always have only two columns. The same for the pairwise mean comparison in ANOVA. So we have two columns, and we have 1, 2, 3. We have three variables or three group comparisons, and then we're going to add an extra row so we can put our p-value information there at the bottom. Now what we'll type here is our title, which is party control of state legislature, because this is, you see here, legislative control, right? That's the information that's going into the table. We don't put anything at this row necessarily. We don't put the % Trump in the table because the title is telling us that that's the dependent variable. So the title should always kind of indicate what these variables right here, the independent variables, what they are trying to explain or predict. So the dependent variable is always conveyed kind of through the title, never in the table. So here, party control of the state legislature is telling us what our different groups are, and then we simply enter those groups down below. And once you've entered these p-values in one table, you can simply copy and paste those right into the bottom. And again, we're going to merge, I'm sorry, that's the layout tab. We're going to merge this bottom row right down here. And now we're going to report over here in our second column what this data is telling us. So we know that this is our level of contrast. We're going to hit Shift-Enter to go underneath contrast, parentheses, standard error, and then we'll begin entering the data. So I like to enter the coefficient or the value first, and then I like to enter the standard error underneath that. So again, anytime you want to enter a value underneath something in the same cell, simply hit Shift-Enter, and that brings the cursor underneath that value in the same cell. So now let's enter the standard error. And now we have all of the information that we need directly in our new reformatted table. The last thing we have to do is assign p-values to the contrast integer here. So we would look at our p-value from our data output. Are any of these statistically significant? We would say yes. All of those at the 3-star level. So we simply add stars here. And there you go. You have completed your pairwise mean comparison between the groups. Now, the last type of table we're going to make will report our results from a regression model. So again, this could be bivariate or it could be multivariate, but the way we report that data is going to be pretty much the same as the pairwise comparison we just did for the ANOVA. Right, so we'll type in our title, which will be top table 4. And now we will create our table. So again, the only thing that we're going to be reporting here is the variable name, the coefficient, the standard error, and the p-value. So we only need 2 columns. Insert 2. And how many variables do we have? 1, 2, 3. So 1, 2, 3. And then an additional row down here for our p-values. Here we type in variable, and then we type in coefficient, shift enter, parentheses, standard error, and we enter our variable names here. And then we will merge this down here, and we will copy our p-value information to the very bottom. Now simply enter your coefficients and the standard error in parentheses. Shift enter parentheses. Now we will assign stars, the p-values, to our coefficients if they are statistically significant. We'll look at the south. We see that is statistically significant at the 3-star level, because 0.000 is less than 0.01. Percent minority population, again, 3 stars here. Percent unemployed, we have a p-value of 0.229. That is not less than any of the thresholds that we have set here in our model. So percent unemployed will receive no stars. Right? So down here we would discuss the significance levels for our variables, etc., etc. You could discuss the R-square statistic from your data output here. So and all kinds of things that we learned in class are types of interpretations that you could include in this research paper. All right, so any time that you do have a statistically significant coefficient in your data, I would expect you to be able to interpret that, right? So because region is operationalized as 0 equals non-south and 1 equals the south, this coefficient here of 12 means as we move from or southern states on average had about 13 percentage points for Trump higher than non-south states. Right? So that's a very interesting finding that we have found here in the data. So these are the things that you need to be able to interpret. At any rate, so now we have all of these tables, but they are still not very pretty. I'm going to show you the last thing that you need to do to have a beautiful, well-formatted table. So the first thing that we want to do is we'll select all of this data here, and we want to go to this box right here, which tells us where we have lines that separate the rows and the columns, and let's just go to no borders at all. Okay, we're going to go to this first one and say that we want a segmenting border at the bottom, and we want a segmenting border to separate the p-value from the rest of the data. And then we want a segmenting border at the very end, which ends the table. And we can also put one, we can use the top border here. All right, so now we have a really well-established table, and all the necessary information is segmented properly. We could also bold these, okay? And I like to do this center here. So this kind of tells you where it's centered, if it's at the top, the middle, or the bottom. So I like to do center, or that might look a little weird, so we can put this one to the left over here. So you might also want to align these by decimal if you want to go the extra mile, right? So you would come up here and you would click until you get to the period, and then just place that right about here, somewhere in the center, right? And you can move that around if you like until it's nice and centered. And that looks really good. And then again. So lastly, I like to keep all of the borders on the correlation matrix tables just because there's so many values and they're in descending order that this, I think, is the best way to read this type of data. So this has been the tutorial in how to create academic tables in your research paper. This is exactly kind of what your research paper is going to look like for section 4. It's going to have all of these different models in it, all of these different tables. Underneath the table, you will discuss the data and the extent to which you were able to reject or confirm the null hypothesis. Right? So just by making these tables, we were able to get 2 full pages. Down here, you would have your conclusion section, and you would talk about all of your different hypotheses, the methods you used to test those hypotheses, and the number of hypotheses you were able to either reject or confirm. Under that section, you'd have the bibliography, and then your research paper is complete. So I hope this tutorial was helpful. Please email me if you have any questions, and I will see you on Thursday for our final exam review.